This incredible story was told to me by a friend of my grandfather's when he was still alive. He served as a radio operator during World War II. I've heard similar stories many times, especially from those who served in the forces providing communications. Perhaps this case was recorded by someone I don't know, but I will try to pass this story on to you as I heard it. I will try to recount all the conversations that I was able to remember to give a clearer picture of what was going on there. It was in 1944, a couple months after the famous Normandy landings of the Allied forces. An American battalion was preparing to cross a small river. To develop the offensive, a powerful tank attack was being prepared to chase the Germans into Germany. The bank on the other side of the river was steep, overgrown with various bushes and trees. At the water's edge, there were willow branches sticking out of the water, from which hung dried-up mud which looked like gauze. 3 scouts were scrutinizing the opposite shore with binoculars and marking their marks on the map. They were Sergeant Stevenson and Privates Bykowski and Millie. They were lying among the young trees and scrutinizing this very shore through binoculars.
"This is the most convenient place to cross the river unnoticed,"
said the sergeant. He carefully put the binoculars back in their case, fastened the button, and looked at the map. An explosion rumbled over the river bend, and a flock of birds took to the sky on the other side.
"The crossing is our first point,"
said the sergeant.
"How many in all?"
Millie asked.
4 in all, but the crossing is the first,"
Stevenson added.
"Point 2, swampy lowland, through which we will pass to this grove."
The sergeant enclosed the topographical grove in a circle.
"Point 3, behind the grove is a motorized regiment. There are woods, gullies, ravines, there's a place to hide. We'll pass through as conveniently as we can. And further on, right here near the grove, there should be a convoy of trucks."
"What convoy?" Bykowski asked. With the 4th point, the sergeant was now shading the rectangle, marking the approximate location of the column.
"That's what you need to find out. This is your point 4.
Intervened Lieutenant Madison, suddenly crept up from behind.
Division headquarters is planning a tank offensive. I won't tell you where, because I don't know. Regimental reconnaissance has been done, everything seems to be ready, and suddenly, surprise. This convoy came, guarded as if the bodies were full of gold. Did the trucks just happen to show up right before the offensive? Or did they? In the headquarters do not want to risk, so ask to find out what is there."
"We'll find out,"
nodded the sergeant.
"Our call sign is Utah, yours is Alamo.
Lieutenant Madison said.
The frequency is the same as the day before yesterday. You'll report back after each of the 4 points has been accomplished, as requested by headquarters. You'll go tonight, after dark. The boat's already prepared. You have 24 hours for everything. And also, be careful. The Germans are shooting mortars into the neighborhood."
As dusk fell, Lieutenant Madison came to the edge of the village to the cabin where the 3 scouts were preparing for their mission. The lean and wiry scouts resembled each other only in figure. They were called brothers by many, though there was no resemblance in their faces and they were of opposite personalities. Sergeant Stevenson was older, well-versed in German, and was known as an open and cheerful fellow, easy to get along with. Private Millie, younger, was in charge of the radio, serious and thoughtful. Private Bykowski was a remarkably good-natured fellow, though brave in battle, for which he had received the Silver Star. The 4 of them smoked, standing under the beautiful night sky. And only in the distance explosions rumbled. Madison smoked too, because he wanted to support the guys, to be with them, maybe to partially integrate into the closed and established group. The scouts took their ammunition and weapons and moved to the river, where a boat was already prepared in the bushes. Waiting next to the boat were 2 more watching soldiers who were to report to Madison on the successful crossing. The scouts passed, taking turns shaking the commander's hand. Bykowski lingered unexpectedly. He looked surprisingly embarrassed, crumpling a letter in his bony fist. "There's a letter to my family. Send it if we don't come back, sir." Madison took the letter and nodded, then went to his lodge where his radio operator was. The radio operator, a shy, bright-eyed boy of about 20, was tuning the wave. The crackle and howl of the air filled the cramped room. Against the far wall on a shell crate stood a telephone, a heavy square block with a receiver. Lieutenant Madison thought he should brew some strong coffee. It was going to be a long night. Another explosion rumbled outside, and a brief shudder ran through the walls. The blast seemed closer to him than the previous ones. Madison looked in that direction out of inertia, and instead of the coffee pot, he picked up the telephone receiver to contact division headquarters.
"How's it going over there?"
Came the voice on the other end of the wire.
Sir, they're gone.
"Report on every point.
The voice hesitated and added,
We are not sleeping here, too.
Yes, sir.
Talk to you later, Lieutenant."
Putting the phone back on the base, Madison thought for a moment.
Do you want coffee?
No thanks, he said, embarrassed.
Have some coffee. It's going to be a long night, and I need you to stay awake.
No, I won't fall asleep. The radio operator was even more embarrassed, turned to the station and repeated several times, Alamo, Alamo, I'm Utah. Alamo, I'm Utah. Madison shrugged and picked up the coffee pot. When the mug was full, he heard a familiar cough from the entrance. It was Private Turner, one of the 2 soldiers who had stayed on shore to watch the crossing.
Well, did they swim across?
He asked, taking a sip of coffee. A fit of coughing bent Turner. He intended to sit down on the bench, but missed it, and slid down the wall to the floor. The surprised lieutenant stepped toward the private and only then noticed his pale, twisted face.
Sir, a mine! Right at them! They just set sail! The mine hit them, the 3 of them!
The private sitting on the floor spoke hysterically.
"How so, sir?"
Let's go.
Lieutenant Madison said in a low voice and went outside. I watched them go out the window. Dark clouds blocked the sky. The water in the river seemed tarry, and the river itself gloomy and alien. Not at all like it had been during the day, when they were lying among the trees, when Stevenson was itemizing the mission. It was hard, almost impossible to believe that there was no one left of the group. Not 20 minutes had passed when Madison had talked with the boys, when they had smoked together under the starry sky, listening to the rumble of distant bursts. He didn't believe it when he saw the sand-covered bodies scattered along the shore. But it was them. It was impossible to be mistaken. Half an hour later, the dead scouts were put into an old tent and carried to the house where they were preparing for the mission. The lieutenant returned to the house lethargic, as if sleep-deprived. Passing through the doorway, he bumped painfully against a jam beam. I, the radio operator, sat as if pinned to a chair, for I had not received orders that the operation was over. The station was working. There was a crackle of interference from the speaker. I was broadcasting the group's call signs in an uncertain voice, and Madison thought it looked unimaginably stupid under the circumstances.
Stop it.
He said in a muffled voice. I turned around. His face was as if someone had hit him unjustly and painfully. At that moment, the crackle from the speaker grew louder, and through it came a voice.
Utah, on the Alamo!"
Sitting with my back to the radio station, I stared dumbfounded at Lieutenant Madison, who was frozen like a statue. And behind me, the chatter continued.
Utah, on the Alamo! On the Alamo! Do you hear me?"
I slowly turned to the machine and looked at the tuning scales in amazement, as if I had seen them for the first time in my life. Madison slumped exhaustedly on the bench. What am I going to do? I asked in a shaky voice.
Answer if you're being summoned.
Alamo. I'm Utah. I frantically spoke, falling to the microphone. We hear you.
Utah.
The interference extinguished the voice, but after a second he reappeared.
Here badly.
Alamo, go ahead. We can hear you fine.
Uh-huh. I'm reporting that we've passed point 1. We've passed point. We're moving on point 2. Point 2. How do you understand me?
If the dead bodies of the scouts were not now lying in a house on the outskirts of the ruined village, if Madison and his soldiers had not dragged them there with their own hands, then from this message he would have realized that Stevenson's group had crossed the river and was now moving through the swamps. Roger that, I replied.
I'll be in touch, Utah.
The voice was gone. The space beneath the heavy vault of the house was once again filled with the crackle of uninhabited ether. The things and people in the room remained the same, but something had changed. "What am I to do?" I asked.
The same thing you did before.
"But that soldier said the scouts were dead."
Who died? Didn't you hear?
Madison glared angrily, stuffing the handkerchief into his pocket.
They're in the swamps now. They'll report back as soon as they pass.
The ringing of the phone struck a nerve.
Well, how are you?
Came from the receiver the voice of the chief of intelligence of the division.
They crossed the river.
Reported the lieutenant. He swallowed and added,
Now they are going through the swamps.
That's good. Why don't you report? We are worried here if something has happened. Report as it develops.
Madison hung up the phone, left the house, and fell to the ground. He was no longer sure of what he had said to the radio operator. He was no longer sure he had heard Millie's radio operator's voice. After lying on the ground, he got up, shook the black soil off his knees, and went back into the house. I continued to summon the Alamo. The lieutenant walked past me and poured himself a fresh pot of coffee. He looked thoughtful and detached from everything. Paradoxically, he was brought back to reality by a voice coming from the speaker again.
Utah! I am the Alamo! I'm the Alamo. Do you hear me?
Millie again. You could hear him worse than last time, but you could still hear him. Alamo, I'm Utah. We hear you. I answered a little worried, but I didn't make a fuss.
Utah, I can't hear you very well. We're past point 2. We're through point 2. We're okay. We see piglets. A lot of piglets, but it's okay. Do you copy?
We hear you. We're past point 2. You're seeing piglets. I saw Lieutenant Madison barely resist taking the microphone away from me. He didn't know what he was going to say, and it didn't matter. He just wanted to make sure a real, live Private Millie answered him.
I can't hear you very well. We won't be in contact after point 3. It's dangerous. I repeat, no contact after point 3. Next contact after point 4. Goodbye.
That goodbye disappeared into the crackle of static. Madison looked into his empty mug.
I think I'm going crazy.
He told her. He dryly reported the new message to headquarters and went outside under the starry sky. When he returned 10 minutes later, he lay down on the bench and fell asleep instantly. He was roused from his slumber by my loud voice. Alamo, I'm Utah. I'm listening. Sunlight streamed through a crack in the wall. Lieutenant Madison rose slowly.
Utah, I'm the Alamo.
Sergeant Stevenson spoke himself. Madison was almost overcome with happiness when he heard the sergeant's voice.
We're at point 4. We're there.
The lieutenant pushed me away from the microphone.
What's up, Stevenson? What?
We got to the trucks. There's grenade-firing guns in the crates. In the crates. Repeat. Grenade-firing guns. The Germans call them Panzerfausts. Lots of crates. Third day they've been shipping in. It says they're burning through the tank. I repeat, from 100 feet they burn through a tank. Do you hear that?
I hear you, Stevenson. I hear it.
Sergeant Stevenson paused.
Sir?
It's me, Stevenson. I'm here.
Sir, there's something strange going on here.
The voice faded, eaten away by static, then revived again.
Bukowski's sick, and there's these following us everywhere, and they don't have mouths.
Sarge, come back. You hear me? Come back.
I can barely hear you, Utah. But we're coming back. We're going home.
Madison stood beside me for a long time, and I looked up at him questioningly. When the hammering in his chest subsided and Madison could breathe, he moved to the phone.
Panzerfaust?
Surprised, the chief of intelligence interjected and said not into the receiver.
Panzerfaust, sir. Not those things that caused Williams to lose more than half of his tanks?
A short silence, followed by a bass voice.
Calling division headquarters. We need to change the plan of attack.
A pause, in which Madison guessed a puff from a cigarette.
Yeah, thank your men. Tell them I'll petition for an early discharge home for everyone.
The major went back to the phone.
Did you hear that, Madison? On behalf of the regiment commander, I express my gratitude to you and the guys. Then there will still be an order to award. Do you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
Answered the lieutenant. The day flew by. The evening came. While waiting for a new message, Lieutenant Madison never went outside again. The second radio operator, who arrived to replace me, he sent back, "A new man is not needed," and I myself refused to leave. All day long we called the Alamo, but there was no answer. Toward nightfall, the lieutenant was inclined to think that Stevenson's message was the last. They can't go back. Where could they go back to? To their disfigured bodies now lying in the house? It was utterly impossible. He couldn't imagine such a thing. There's no place for them to go back to. With each passing hour, his heart grew more and more sickened. He was no longer waiting for a message, but he still wouldn't leave the house and made the exhausted me repeat the call signs over and over again on the air. It was about midnight when the lieutenant was sitting with a cauldron in his hands and his mouth full of cold porridge. It was at this moment that Sergeant Stevenson's voice arose.
"We are lost,"
the sergeant said tiredly. The voice was so distant, as if it came from another galaxy.
"I don't know where we are. There are some crooked trees here. The ground is hot. Vapors rise from them and it's impossible to breathe."
I looked fearfully at the lieutenant, who was listening to the speaker's message and did not dare to swallow or spit out the disgusting mush, so as not to miss a single word.
"I don't know where to go, but I can see distant buildings on the hill. The trail leads there, but it's easier to go down. Bykowski's not well at all. His chest has collapsed. I'm bleeding from my ears and my head hurts all the time."
That's the end of the message. I clutched at the microphone, calling fiercely for the group, but Sergeant Stevenson didn't respond. The lieutenant spit his gruel into the pot and set it aside. They were going straight where decent men like them shouldn't go. He had already guessed how the trip would end. He was sure of it, for there it began to happen to them what the mortar shell that had fallen on them had done to them here. The sergeant's face, contorted with deathly fear, rose again before his eyes. The night behind the canopy seemed deep and endless. I fell asleep with my cheek pressed against the table. The lieutenant did not wake me up, and sat down at the radio himself. Somewhere at the end of the second hour, when heavy thoughts overflowed his head, he lost his way and unconsciously repeated with dead lips,
Sarge! Jim, answer me! Jim! Jim! Jim!
And the Utah response came through. Incredibly, it came. But it was so far away, it was like it didn't exist, as if it were a rumored mirage.
"Sir."
Stevenson seemed excited, though it's easy to make a mistake at this volume.
"Forget what I said last time. Forget everything. You won't believe it. We've climbed a hill. These buildings, they're our houses, you know? Millie's house is across from mine. Bykowski's house is right there. They're right next to each other, and it's so nice.
The station shrieked, swallowing the rest of the sentence.
Charlotte has really grown up. Sir, give us 24 hours, and we'll be back."
The lieutenant was trying not to look at me, I realized, though I'd just woken up and was staring at the commander with my eyes flapping incomprehensibly.
"And also, Bykowski asked me to tell..."
The lieutenant barely distinguished these last words.
"Tom, don't send the letter. Don't send it. There's no need now."
There were no more radio messages from Sergeant Jim Stevenson's team. Never. Lieutenant Madison informed the company and the command that the sergeant's group had died heroically while escaping from the enemy rear. The next night, he and his soldiers buried the bodies. By the winter of 1944, about Lieutenant Madison, the commander of the reconnaissance company, went two strange tales. They said that in his clipboard he had 3 perfectly sharpened pencils, which he never wrote with, but only occasionally looked at them. And it was also said that sometimes, after a successful offensive or the capture of a city, he would sit down near the radio station and, turning the tuning knob, listen to the bottomless air.